As Megan has said, my PhD is exploring how belief in rape myths impacts jury decision-making in rape trials, and I'll be carrying out research with members of the Northern Ireland public later this year. Rape myths, false beliefs and preconceptions about rape, rapists and rape survivors are rooted in the patriarchy, male domination of women, which has existed for many centuries in most parts of the world. And part of my hypothesis, which is where this presentation comes from, is that Northern Ireland has a particularly acute patriarchy because of its unique cultural and social history. And I argue that a major cause of that is the powerful and pervasive influence of fundamentalist religion in this part of the world that pervades many areas of life here. And there are other contributory factors that have kind of consolidated and magnified the patriarchy here, not least the recent 30-year conflict. So I'm just fumbling for my next slide, please bear with me here. Okay. So rape myths generally, not always, but generally shift blame from the perpetrator to survivor, and they can bias rape trials towards acquittal. There's a lot of research out there with mock juries, which has shown this. We're not, of course, allowed in the UK to talk to real jurors or to observe their deliberations, but there's already a lot of research out there that shows that they can be prejudicial. Rape myths, as I said, are rooted in patriarchy. Both systems endorse rigid heterosexual binary gender roles, where men are seen as sexually active, sexually aggressive, women as passive. They're stuck with this role of moral gatekeeper. And both systems reject non-binary and non-heterosexual sexuality. How does this fit into religion? I'm talking about Christianity here, but of course this also applies to fundamentalist versions of most major world religions, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism. But because Christianity is the dominant religion in this part of the world, I'm discussing that. So, of course, there are feminist readings and alternative readings of the scriptures, but I'm talking about fundamentalism here. So we've got a male deity, male prophets, male church leaders. We've got patriarchal interpretations of the scriptures, which endorse prescribed gender roles. Very important, and we'll talk a little more about this later, very important too in Northern Ireland, the doctrine of headship. That somehow if men and women are a team, say in marriage, that men are in charge, but like the managing director or the chief executive. Got a little picture here of Eve in the Bible from Genesis, and this is to illustrate that bad women in the Bible, Eve, of course, responsible for introducing original sin into the world by tempting Adam. Bad women in the Bible, we think of people like Delilah, Jezebel, are portrayed as weak, wayward temptresses, and good women as obedient and subservient to men. Some interesting research here about religious beliefs. Religious believers, whether they're fundamentalists or not, tend to be more patriarchal. Fundamentalists are more inclined to believe rape myths, and a really interesting one there at the bottom. Even non-fundamentalists and non-believers lean towards patriarchy in more fundamentalist societies. Everyone takes a little bit of a shift to the right, and it is the right, the socially conservative, politically right, that's associated with fundamentalist religions. Northern Ireland. From its inception, a staunchly religious part of the world, 45% of people here are regular churchgoers, go to church more than, or at least once a month. That's compared to something like 25% in England, according to the same survey. 91% of people here identify as Protestant or Catholic. Only 8% identify as no religion, and one very small percentage, 1%, are other religions like Muslim, Jewish. And many people see themselves, many Northern Irish people see themselves as fundamentalists or traditional Christians. That's a less quantifiable figure because, of course, there are gradients of belief. It's not as cut and dried as saying, I go to church or I'm Protestant or Catholic. But there's a deep fundamentalist tradition here. So how does this influence life? Oh, and two other factors that come in here. Very prevalent in this part of the world, colonial and sectarian mindsets. Like patriarchy, this connects to the patriarchal point. These are based on a superior, inferior dyad, them and us. We're better than those people. And the psychological evidence to show that if you have one prejudice, that often you have the type of mindset that you have other prejudices. Sometimes you have the whole box set. So sometimes people who have that sectarian mindset or racist mindset, they also have a sexist mindset or other prejudices. So it's all kind of tied in. In Northern Ireland, religion is very closely linked to national identity and political loyalties. The whole statelet was set up because of religious division, and we associate Irish Catholics with nationalism, British Protestants with British Unionist. Stormont in the pre-direct rule period in the 70s, but Stormont from the 1920s onwards, many Unionist MPs were also Protestant clergymen, and they were all men, the clergymen, and mostly the MPs were as well, and Orange men, and the Orange Order as well, a deeply patriarchal and quasi-religious organisation. On the other side, the Catholic Church still has huge grassroots community influence, and there are theories that the Protestant hierarchy allowed that because it didn't interfere with their overall dominance of Northern Ireland, and also that they didn't want to alienate the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland through the last century anymore. So that was allowed. So both denominations, Protestant and Catholic, big influence through politics and through grassroots control. Just to illustrate the point, Reverend Ian Paisley, a hugely influential figure on the political scene here for many, many decades. Both founder of his own church, fundamentalist Free Presbyterian Church, and founder of the hardline Democratic Unionist Party, former First Minister, and led both those organisations, the DUP and the Free Presbyterian Church, for many, many decades, and I'd say was very, very dominant influence on politics here. And you can see from his quote, back to that fundamentalist religious doctrine of headship, men being in charge, that the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was opposed to many things, equal rights for women and reproductive freedom being just a couple, that he was a firm believer in the doctrine of headship, of men being in charge. But on all sides, I say, on both the Protestant and Catholic side, I say religious identity, religious ideology is very tied to political identity, to national identity, and both Catholics who may think of themselves as Irish, Irish nationalists, and Protestants who may think of themselves as British, as Ulster people. Women, this was all tied up by how they viewed female sexuality, and women were paradoxically viewed, back to Eve in a way, Eve in the Bible, as the chief upholders of national morality, the moral gatekeepers, but also as its greatest threat. You can see here a picture in the middle of Mother Ireland, very symbolic figure, mother of the nation, the bearer of the patriotic sons, but also a symbol of purity, a bit like the Virgin Mary. And throughout the last century, and indeed into this, politics and the state allowed the religious organisations control of female sexuality. Picture here on one side of the women in the Magdalen laundries, with sort of reform homes for sexually wayward women. And the ads on the other side of the screen come from the Second World War, where women were accused of spreading, women, interestingly, not men, were accused of spreading sexually transmitted diseases. It's very interesting in the literature of that time, both in the court reports of sexual offence trials and the medical reports and the statements of the bishops and the churches. Very sexually loaded language that's tied up with rape mythology, where women were seen as suspect, as good time girls, perhaps prostitutes. There were slurs cast on their characters, even in the medical reports of the time, whereas men were the adventurers who were led astray. So we get the language of rape mythology there. Although the Protestant and Catholic politicians were very divided in their national allegiances and political interests, they were united on moral issues, and still are to a great extent. The Catholic and many of the Protestant churches on issues like sex education in schools, reproductive rights, family planning clinics, abortion, equal rights for women and the LGBT community. In many respects, Northern Ireland lagged behind England and English legislation in this. And in fact, they were only really forced to introduce some of these equal rights measures because of the European Court of Human Rights and the Westminster Parliament. And then another factor, which I think has been a major contributory factor to the acute patriarchy in Northern Ireland, the 30-year conflict that we went through towards the end of the last century, described as an armed patriarchy there by Cathy Harkin, a Derry social worker, in the top quote. The conflict enabled, normalised and concealed much sexual violence. Unlike the kind of standard measure of rape as a weapon of war, where we think of kind of mass rape by enemy combatants, it took on many different forms in Northern Ireland, from the strip searching of female Republican prisoners to the harassment of women at army checkpoints, to rape and sexual assault within people's own communities by paramilitary leaders. And there was a deeply, some of the commentators talk about a hyper-masculinity in the very heavily militarised police force, British Army on the streets, and the paramilitaries, of course, hugely predominantly male. And then last slide here, after the conflict, problems with the peace process. The Good Friday Agreement hugely focused on dealing with the sectarian issue, the Protestant Catholic problems, and very little focus on achieving gender equality or on reparations, or indeed even acknowledging a lot of the hidden sexual violence during the Troubles. So I would argue that these are many of the factors that have led to an acute patriarchy in Northern Ireland, and may indeed, we'll find out when I do a bit more research, may indeed have led to a more entrenched and widespread rape mythology throughout its population.